Shabbat Shalom. Where are we? Well, the sign out says 50 Moss Road, or South Moss Road, if we're going to be precise. But if you were going to be extremely precise, you would probably want to give our coordinates, which I'm guessing nobody here knows, myself included, because we could work out exactly what our latitude and longitude is, and that would pinpoint our location precisely. Indeed, I'm sure that everybody in this room has used a GPS at some time, which does that automatically for you. But if you didn't have a GPS, how would you figure out your latitude? Remember, latitude is how far north or south you are along the globe. With the stars, with the sun, you can measure with some tools or making your own observations exactly where you are. And indeed, this is something that you could learn to do if you wanted to do on your own. It is not terribly hard, with a little bit of time and practice, to work out where you are north or south of the equator. Very simple. If you want to figure out your longitude, that is how far east or west you are around the globe, what would you do? It works on time.
You have to draw a zero through Greenwich, and then go every 15 degrees is 1 hour.
All right, so let's get the basics here. So in order to figure out exactly where you are on the globe, east or west, and the geography major is helping, I'm doing the heavy lifting for everyone else in the room. To do the longitudinal calculations, first you're going to have to pick a place. You're going to have to pick some spot on the globe because, I don't know if you know this, but the Earth is round. And unlike the equator, where there's actually a middle going this way around, north and south, which is very easy to spot because of the tilt of the Earth on its axis, going east and west, there is no obvious geographical spot that you can then measure from east and west. Instead, you're going to have to pick one, and it's going to be arbitrary. Now, we are left with Greenwich, which is in England, as being the prime meridian, as being 0 on the map, and that's worked out all right, especially when you get into the Pacific for the other side. It's actually not a bad place to work from. And then you're going to have to figure out what time is it in Greenwich, and what time is it here? And by doing the math in between them, you can work out how far east or west you are from that Greenwich Mean Time, from that 0 hour in Greenwich. Everybody following this? Which means if you are going back through history, it was easy for thousands of years for people to figure out how far north or south they were. This is something that thousands of years ago was figured out. And it was impossible to figure out how east or west you were until the 1700s. There was about a 2,000-year lag in figuring out our east-west location compared to our north-south location. And that lag of a few thousand years and the impossibility of figuring this out meant that thousands and thousands of people died. They died in shipwrecks when they would turn, thinking that they had moved far enough east or west to avoid a hazard, and it turned out they hadn't. They would die from starvation when they would turn east or west when they should have gone the opposite and go out to sea and run out of supplies. They died over and over and over again for this problem. And it wasn't solved until 1736 and 1741. And 1761. It was solved by a self-taught clockmaker in England named John Harrison. And he worked out that if you made a really, 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 really good clock, which was far better than anything else anyone else had made, and you set that clock to Greenwich time, and you took it with you when you got on your boat, then you could keep checking it and check the local time based off the position of the sun or the stars, and you would know where you were. And the first model that he made in 1736 worked. It's not quite as accurate as a modern wristwatch, but it was pretty good. Good enough that it could have gone all the way across the Atlantic and back and only had you off by a couple miles east-west, which was an amazing revolution in not only clock-making technology, but also in geographical technology. And Mr. Harrison said, "It's not good enough. I'll work on a better one." And the Royal Academy said, "Well, but, all right." And he came back 5 years later with another model, which was even more accurate than the first. And he said, "It's not good enough. I need a little more money, a little more time, and I'll work on a replacement." 20 years later, the replacement shows up now in the form of an actual hand watch rather than a larger clock. And finally, he was satisfied enough to be able to open it up, teach others how to make it, and something that would cost almost the same as a ship began to be used to establish the longitude. And it is one of the reasons why the British Navy had a huge head start over many of the other navies in their conquests and their military. More than 20 years passed. And in that time, there were hundreds of more sailing catastrophes and tens of thousands of more lives lost. His quest for perfection made him a murderer. His refusal to accept good enough because of his obsession with making it as perfect as humanly possible with the tools of his generation meant that innocent people died. Oftentimes when we seek the perfect, we end up sacrificing the good. And this is the question that God has throughout the first few chapters of Genesis up till this point in our Torah portion. God has a question. He knows that humanity is, shall we say, prone to both great acts of goodness and great acts of evil. And God has a solution that will help people avoid the bad and do the good. That solution is, of course, called the Torah. But there's a problem. God can't just plonk the Torah down in the middle of, the street and expect that it will be picked up and adopted. God needs a teacher, a transmitter, somebody that will be able to take Torah into the world as its champion and lead a nation into its observance, into the Brit, the covenant, so the Torah can have a permanent place in this world and from that point grow and expand and spread. Now that eventually is going to be, of course, Moses. But God has a problem. What does he do in the meantime? Until Moses comes along, does God just sit back and twiddle God's thumbs? Remember, God doesn't actually have thumbs. We're using idioms here. And say, well, it's a shame, but got another 400 years until Moses shows up, so I guess we just sit back and let stuff fall apart. No. Instead, God goes, well, I can't give the Torah to Abraham because he is not quite the perfect man to take this into the world. There is no one in his generation more perfect, for sure, but he would not be able to transmit the Torah perfectly. So I will instead approach, connect, and teach him to the best of his ability, and it will be a little imprecise. It will not be the whole Torah, but he'll get much of it. He'll get Brit Milah, the act of circumcision, the entry into a covenant, the acknowledgement of God's existence and God's singular unity, and he will also understand the lessons of justice and kindness. When God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah in this week's Torah portion, he says, I probably should talk about this with Abraham. Why? Because his children will be responsible for justice, and they need to understand what is happening. Now, they are not going to be given the Torah to carry out all of the rules that God eventually will give to Moses and the nation at Sinai, but God needs to begin somewhere. And yes, Abraham may be a few degrees off of Moses' perfection, but by beginning with Abraham, God is able to begin to stem the flow and the pain of the world, begin to grow a nation that will be able to hear Moses more carefully and more clearly, so that Moses has a little bit less work to do. Rather than Moses coming into a completely blank slate and saying, hey guys, I've got this thing called Torah, and finding a world that was indifferent, he would find at least one nation that had already been primed to receive this instruction. Imperfectly, yes, but at least somewhat ready. God is not a perfectionist. God does not demand only the perfect to receive Torah. God does not demand only the perfect to be in connection and to receive instruction, because God knows that we are imperfect, and that's why we need God. When God reaches out to Abraham, he is not only teaching us that God cares about the humanity, but also teaching us that God does not only rest upon those that are perfect. And we should not expect ourselves to be perfect before we can enter into not only connection with God, but study and action and living a meaningful and powerful life according to the Torah. The Torah is not what you receive as a graduation gift into the upper ranks of humanity. The Torah is what you receive as a beginning tool in order to lift you up into the higher levels of human existence. And it works with you as you are. It does not expect you to be perfect yet. If you were perfect, you wouldn't need it. Instead, it thinks you're good enough. God made you as a human being, and the Torah was designed for humans. Take with it as you can. Yes, you may be a few miles off here and there. It may not be as precise as the satellite positioning that we have. But from where you are using the Torah, you will travel further and more accurately than without. You will turn what is good into better. And that is its ultimate mission and ultimate goal. And that is the calling that God has given to all of us. Not to be perfect, just to be better. Shabbat Shalom.